Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Greetings and welcome to All Things Policy podcast of the Takshashila Institution. I'm Abhishek Kadiyala, a research analyst with the Indo-Pacific program of the Takshashila Institution, and I'll be a host for today. Today, I'm also joined by two researchers from the Center for Social and Economic Progress, CSEP, to discuss the approaches of India and China in the Indian subcontinent. First, we have Constantino Xavier, a senior fellow in foreign policy and security studies at CSEP in New Delhi. He leads the Samand Initiative on Regional Connectivity and is also a non-resident fellow in the Foreign Policy Program of the Brookings Institute in Washington. His research focuses on India's role as a regional power, with particular attention to the intersecting dimensions of security, connectivity, and democracy across the Indian subcontinent and the Indian Ocean regions. Joining him is Shruti Jargad, her non-resident research associate in the Foreign Policy and Security vertical at CSEP. Her expertise lies in China's party-state system, its domestic politics, and China's relations within the neighborhood. Welcome, Constantine and Shruti. It's a pleasure to have you with us today.
Hi,
Thanks,
Abhishek.
Abhishek.
So let us dive directly into the crux of the matter based on your recent report. Let us discuss the semantics that are particularly being used by both India and China with relation to the Indian subcontinent. I'll start with Constantino.
Yeah, thanks, Abhishek. Always good to see people like you featuring and actually reading our studies. So thanks for doing that and having us on your great podcast that we all regularly listen. Abhishek, I think the best work is always collaborative work. I enjoyed working with Shruti because she's obviously a rising China expert here in the think tank system and has lived across the Chinese-speaking space, both in Taiwan and in Beijing. And I work more on the neighborhood and on the great power relations in South Asia. And it was collaborative because we really, I think, learned from each other. I think Shruti's looked at the outbound Chinese perspective, how they look at the region. She's analyzed, deconstructed, interpreted a few hundred speeches by officials from the Chinese state, the Chinese party, the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Chinese leadership. And I've looked at this also from the context, obviously, of South Asia, the politics, the governance space in this region. And in many ways, what came out in the form of the paper is how China speaks about this region, which is not always a perfect indicator of how they think about things. There's a gap sometimes between what governments and leaders say and how they think, but it's, I think, an approximation. And at least for me, it has been a learning experience because, as you'll see in the paper, we have a variety, up to 9 different perspectives that are very different in how China looks at what we generally call South Asia or the Indian neighborhood.
Yes. Shruti, any comments? Anything to add on that?
No, again, thank you so much for having us on this podcast. And I think what it enables us to do also is just go over the findings that we had. As Dr. Xavier also mentioned, that we have these 9 different narratives that we find, and some of these often contradict each other. So, very happy to be here and discussing what we found and how it's different from, or maybe similar to, what India does in its neighborhood.
Okay. Thank you. I'm pretty sure that a lot of people read your work and it is pretty impactful. So let us try to understand how both India and China define the neighborhood, right? What does China consider part of the Indian subcontinent, and how does India try to define it? And we can probably also look at an angle wherein both of them overlap in their perspectives, because you have defined how the 9 different ways in which China looks at it, and there's also a lot of like a systematic differentiation which is focused more on specific aspects of the foreign policy, like be it economy, security, and that kind of thing, right? And China has unique definition perspective for all of that. Can we discuss more on that? Shruti, I'll go with you first.
Right. So the 9 perspectives that we find out in what the Chinese officials are saying, not all of them are definitional. So, in our paper, what we do is that we divide these 9 perspectives into 4 themes. And the first theme is what relates to defining South Asia. And what we find is that there is no fixed definition. In some cases, China is excluding somebody. In some cases, the Chinese narratives are including some countries. And so we find that there are 4 different kinds of definitions that China is employing when it comes to South Asia. The most interesting one for me was the ecological definition. So, as we all know, that ecological civilizational perspectives have become important in China domestically, and that you can see in its external orientation as well. And what it refers to by this ecological definition is the connections of mountains, the Himalayas, the connections of rivers, the Brahmaputra river system, and how this is connecting China to countries in South Asia. And this definition is particularly interesting is because it allows us to reimagine South Asia as moving northwards, as the gravitational point of South Asia moves northwards to the Himalayas and the connecting the geographies there instead of just being centered around India. So that is one definitional perspective. Another one is economic, where China is talking about connecting the region via corridors. The third definition, and in this economic definition, interestingly, South Asia and Myanmar, East Asia, the Greater Mekong River, all of this become part of one entity instead of it being a division between South Asia and East Asia and Southeast Asia. The third definition that we are looking at is a geopolitical definition where we are talking about exclusion. And this comes up in later themes also, where China is saying that this is a South Asian or an Asian entity, and external players like the US are not part of this region. Again, we also find something interesting where Afghanistan is being referred to as part of Central Asia instead of South Asia, where Afghanistan's neighboring countries, Pakistan, and then countries in Central Asia are being considered more important to the region. And finally, the latest in these various definitions is the civilizational perspective, where China is talking about multiplicity of things. One being that all of these countries are part of the Asian civilization, but at the same time, China is also saying that there are multiple civilizations in Asia, and India and China are one of those. But it is making Maldives part of the same Asian civilization as China is. And then at the same time, if it's an Asian civilization, that means that it excludes other non-Asian countries. So yeah, I'm sure Tino would be able to add more about all of these 4.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many different perspectives and narratives, Abhishek. I think these are the 4 ones that Shruti laid out, the main ones on how China looks at the region. We can go on, but maybe let me give you a preview of the 3 others. One, I mean, in the sequence we discover, which is to India's role, right? I mean, one thing is, of course, how do you define ecologically the region, economically, the geopolitics of the region, and the civilization? These are for sort of 4 different lenses, right? Different sort of perspectives on the neighborhood that India likes to think of as the Indian subcontinent, from Afghanistan to Myanmar, etc. But what's the role India plays in this? And I think there's 3 things we discovered here, and they're quite contradictory, which is perfectly fine. I mean, that's the whole point of our study. I think we found a lot of contradictions in how the different voices, right, the different ways in which China speaks about the region. I mean, Shruti mentioned that it matters where Chinese officials speak. If they speak in Kabul, they will generally, I think Shruti would discover, leave out South Asia and talk more of Central Asia. If they speak in Myanmar or Bangladesh, they tend to emphasize again the sort of Southeast Asian Bay of Bengal dimension to the region. If they're in Kathmandu, to speak to the ecological definition that Shruti was saying, we heard about this, what is it called? The Himalayan Rim Ridge, or sort of Himalayan Rim region that is along the Himalayas, that they see as the focus and the sort of ecological epicenter of the region, because it is the third pole, right? It's future to climate change. It is where all the glaciers are. So, of course, from China, it is a very different South Asia. It is the Himalayan immediate neighborhood for China, which has bordering areas, of course, with Pakistan, India, Nepal, Bhutan, and even Myanmar along the Hindu Himalayan region. The three other learnings are on the role India plays in this. So one, we see a lot of asymmetry. There's a lot of speeches about India as this giant in the region, yeah, and it is surrounded by smaller states that are beholden to India's centrality. There's an inbuilt, quite exceptional asymmetry. If you look at different regions of the world, say Western Africa, if you look at Southeast Asia, even despite Indonesia's size, there's a less of an asymmetry in those regions. Demographically, economically, geographically, even, India plays an extremely central region, and the Chinese describe that regularly as an asymmetric relationship and a problematic relationship. Right? This is the suggestion that India is more of a regional hegemon, sometimes maybe a bully, intervenes, does not know how to deal with this asymmetry. And China's, of course, suggested as a more fair player that respects asymmetry and also is like seeking to countervail it. So that's the first role of India as an asymmetric and rather negative player, if you want. The second one is on equality. And it's not an equality between India and China. That shouldn't be surprises, because that is not part of the Chinese worldview in Asia. No one is an equal to China there. But it's an equality between India and Pakistan. There's a type of a hyphenation. So in Pakistan, you will actually mention India a lot if you're a Chinese official, because you want to suggest to the Pakistanis that you are as much as a regional player as the Indians. Right? In India, they will not mention Pakistan, obviously, but inbuilt is, again, we'll come to it later when it comes to conflict mediation, another sort of view they have on South Asia, that there is a trouble to be solved between India and Pakistan. Both are, equal players in some ways, and both have equal stakes in the region. Let's put it like that: equal stakes, and have both legitimate roles and concerns in the region. And then the third one, which is contradictory, let me finish with that, is about India and China being partners, equality and partnership between India and China. And that's an interesting one, because it clashes with the previous one. If India and Pakistan are equals, suddenly how can China and India be partners also in the region? But the suggestion, at least we sort of decipher from those speeches that we analyze, is that all the problems of South Asia will go away if India partners with China to deliver public goods, something else we'll analyze later again, development solutions, trade, growth solutions, even political solutions for the entire region. So this, you may have heard, Abhishek, is China-India plus one, the partnership that was tested even in Afghanistan when India and China trained some Afghan officials. That's the Chinese idea that India and China are real partners. And last but not least, by China suggesting in speech that these are partners, they're suggesting something else. They're suggesting that China is an equal, legitimate South Asian power, right? It is not India that is in the lead and we will try to work with you, which is, frankly, is a Japanese or American perspective on South Asia. We recognize India's primacy in the region, we'll work with you, but you will take the lead. This is not the Chinese speech. The Chinese speech is, yes, you're a bit more important in play, but we have an equal say. We must, in equal terms, partner together to deliver solutions to the region.
Okay, so if we extend on the very interesting points you made in that, uh, how do we see India's perspective towards this? How does, firstly, India see the entire Indian subcontinent as a whole and its strategy towards it? And how does India also understand China's role in that? And how does India also view, how China views the region and India's role in it?
Um, that's a big one, Abhishek. I think it's. Frankly, the short answer is I wish everyone will read and learn from our paper. I think maybe there's some learning to do even within the Indian policy making system. That's what we like to do. Papers that create new knowledge, change perspectives based on evidence and empirics, which is, of course, something very rich in this paper in the form of these speeches we've analyzed. Let me start first. Maybe the most important, only thing, the hardest thing I can say here, Abhishek, is something that the current external affairs minister has said in public is that more China expertise in Indian think tanks and universities helps policymakers, right? He's on record saying this. I think at the All India China conference, he mentioned this. But let me tell you a concrete example where we think, and maybe we're being a bit arrogant here, but yeah, I think there's some hope that there could be some learning from our study, which is, see, even if you want to counter China's presence in Bangladesh, in Sri Lanka, economic inroads, political influence, etc., you have to understand how China operates. And how China operates, so therefore how China thinks and how China speaks. These are three parts of the triangle: action, thinking, and speaking. And I can think of a few examples, Abhishek, where I think often we, in the system here in India, policy making and policy analysis tend to be a little bit simplistic in how we see China's thinking on South Asia. And that's why we're bothering you with already, I think we did now 4 + 3, 7 different angles. There are a few more, right? Well, let's unpack those next, maybe on I think we have 4 or 5 more, right? Of how new lenses that we see how the Chinese look at the region. But for example, not everything, Abhishek, by the Chinese system hinges on countering India in the region, right? I think that's something we often think, that the Chinese system looks at the region the way India looks at the region, South Asia. We often assume that China regulates every single action with India in mind. I think that's something we see is not correct. The density of bilateral relationships between China and Nepal, China, Bangladesh, China, Sri Lanka is developing separately from the China-India relationship often. So I leave you with that. I think, yes, we can do some learning. And actually, even for those who are maybe gung-ho about countering China or learning from China or working with China, we need a granularity of understanding, which includes contradictions. Absolutely. So there are things the Chinese are saying something. And so let me finish with that. I think even Chinese policymakers can learn from our paper. Maybe that's the greatest ambition we have, because we are unpacking their own speech for them and showing some contradictions, some different tonalities, different emphasis in how they look at the region. So hopefully, yeah, for them too, there'll be some learning from our paper. But I'll leave, some of the more, we can maybe stick a little more to the China perspective, Abhishek, because there's a few more learnings there on how they look at the region. Maybe Shruti can share some of those.
This is especially for Shruti, considering it's more China focused that way. Is what is the potential opportunities and challenges that China faces in connecting with the neighborhood as a whole? With respect to India, is one perspective we're looking at, and is also independent of India's role. It's a two perspective we're going to look at.
Right. That is a very interesting question, of course, and something that we thought about while writing this paper as well. That does China have, and this is a question that we've been dealing with in the whole project, China and South Asia, that is there a cohesive strategy or is there a cohesive policy to how China is dealing with South Asia, how China is acting in South Asia? Are its policies in its bilateral relations part of a larger whole of China and South Asia? So, interesting question, and I will answer that in 2 or 3 parts. I think one of the, and this is something we found in our research also, is South Asia is an extremely complex and diverse region, which means that it is difficult even for individual countries in South Asia to be very clear about what is happening in the other state, what are the socio-cultural, political factors leading to that. So any external country, and right now we are still debating whether China is an external power or whether it is part of South Asia now, has difficulty in dealing with all of this, in understanding all of this historical and social cultural differences and diversity that exist in the region. And so Nepal, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, all of these places have had some kind of popular movements in the past. And it is not always easy for China to understand these because it is a system so rooted in ensuring political stability, in ensuring order. And so, if you even look at the how the Chinese have not just Chinese officials, but also how Nepal is being looked at on social media, it's not always the correct assessment of what is happening. So, when it comes to South Asia, I think the political plurality, social and economic differences in the region, I think make it a challenging region for China. That is one thing. And I know I've spoken a lot already, but I'll just make one more point here, which is when China is trying to understand South Asia, we see that even in the research that the Chinese scholars are doing, there is an emphasis on bilateral relations and on India and Pakistan. So I think that is something that even the Chinese research ecosystem has to deal with in trying to gain expertise on these different countries in the region. And they're doing it to a certain extent, where we've talked about in the past how the Chinese scholars are learning languages in each of these countries. And again, that is something that all major powers in the region can think about, especially India. Yeah.
So I would like to extend on that particular aspect which you mentioned, and which Constantine has also mentioned previously, of China understanding or China perceiving the role of Pakistan, right? So do you think China also perceives Pakistan having a role in the neighborhood region as well, which is equal to or in somewhere compatible to India? Does China perceive it that way?
Again, $1 million question, Abhishek, and especially asking this after Operation Sindoor, so all the
Exactly.
more spicier this question. I mean, beyond, see, we can interpret what they say, and again, we don't look at the triangulation of what they do. We suggest a little bit, but I think that'd be further studies. In fact, the two reports we've done with over 20 case studies called China and South Asia, Teams, Partners, and Tools. That's a CSEP report from 2023 with Professor Jabin Jacob. And now most recently, China and South Asia, behind the scenes and in the open behind the scenes, which is just released 3 months ago, focuses on the actions the Chinese have done, the modus operandi of how they seek influence through a variety of actors across the region. So triangulating it, there'll be two versions, Abhishek. There'll be a maximalist version we hear a lot these days after Operation Sindoor, that China uses Pakistan to deter or contain India within South Asia and the region, is making things more difficult globally by pinning India down within the region, by supporting as much as possible Pakistan through a variety of endeavors, including military, operational, intelligence, but also, of course, economic support. But there's also a different narrative, and the one that emerges more from our paper, which is you will speak about South Asia when you're in Pakistan, but frankly, you don't see much of an action from China that believes that Pakistan is going to be a major regional player to its east, maybe to its west, of course, Afghanistan, Iran, the Gulf. We saw the agreement they just signed with the Saudis. I think there the Chinese are probably more interested. But I would say it's probably towards what we think of South Asia, India, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh. Of course, the Pakistanis are playing games in Bangladesh as we speak today. The Chinese will be occasionally maybe supportive of it. We don't know. That's, of course, work in progress behind the scenes. But Pakistan as a regional player, I don't see the Chinese, supporting or thinking of Pakistan as a source of solutions, of public goods, of economic corridors beyond CPEC, for example.
I think this is among one of the contradictions you mentioned, right? That so China views India and Pakistan as equal kind of players, or somehow hyphenates them, but also doesn't see Pakistan playing a role in the neighborhood. So, in that regard, can we also look at probably India's perspective on the neighborhood, right? What are the challenges and opportunities India faces? And if it is independent of China, or are there also challenges and opportunities that are dependent on China that way?
I think there are two big challenges, and that allows us again to connect with our research findings. I think you would think naturally, all of us would think that India, with 1.4 billion people, a major rising economy, largest population in the world, centrally located within what we call the Indian subcontinent, flanked by important regions such as Central Asia, Southeast Asia, the second largest populous country in the world, China, and of course a massive economy southwards the Indian Ocean region, that would play a very economic and political role in this region. Okay, one of being a lead in terms of public goods delivery and connectivity and economic mechanisms of regional integration, making this a growth engine for the world economy. And second, also being there for political purposes, mediating, building peace, stabilizing, etc. So, Shruti, maybe you can take the second one. I'll stick to the first one because it tells us about how the Chinese are looking at their region, trying to build on what may be perceived as a vacuum or what a space for them to to do stuff that India should be ideally doing, or etc. So you can speak about the political part, Shruti, but on the economic one, Abhishek, there are, I think, two major. This is a major theme, sort of, with South Asia as a growth region and China as a provider, as a facilitator of growth and economic integration in the region. There are two narratives we find that are persistent in Chinese official speech. Narrative number one is on economic corridors, right? And the idea that South Asia will only grow not only if it grows within the region, but if this region is connected through economic arteries and corridors with surrounding regions. Surprise, surprise, particularly China and its hinterland provinces, whether it's the Tibetan Autonomous Region or Yunnan, etc. And that's where the logic of CPEC, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, comes up. That's where CMEC, the China-Myanmar Economic Corridor, makes a repeated entry into the speeches of the Chinese officials. And third, that's where the Trans-Himalayan Connectivity and Economic Corridor makes, again, a regular show in Chinese speeches, which would be a sort of China, Nepal, India, a third sort of corridor of growth connecting China to South Asia. So that's one. You see China constantly saying, we will be the providers of growth or the necessary condition for South Asia to escape its India-centric focus. And we, of course, and it is a much larger economy than India, which provides very important resources to all developing countries across the global south, including to India, of course. A very important play from that perspective. The second narrative within this is China as a provider of public goods. It's a very interesting concept that China will provide not something that is only in the interest of Chinese exports, Chinese investors, but it's China that is also not providing something to bilateral partners, right? Which would be a win-win approach. We've heard that in Chinese phraseology for the last many years. But the idea of public goods is a regional public goods, right? The same red discussion or same idea they have of China as a public goods provider at the global level, new form of multilateralism, connecting the Eurasian hinterland, a new world economy, new types of governance. We saw a lot in Chinese speeches on South Asia of China that is going to build these corridors and provide long-term public goods in terms of trade, economic interdependence, technology, finance, that is going to modernize these economies. So these are two narratives on the economic space of South Asia, where we think India, or where we see India not being always the front runner in providing these solutions. And I think, Sybil, on a political, Shruti, maybe you want to speak on that scene in South Asia, what we learned from the Chinese perspective.
Yes, absolutely. So I remember while we were interpreting all of what we were reading, one of the debates that we had was how to distinguish between economy and politics, because as given China's political system, the two are very tightly intertwined. And according to the Chinese narratives, it is precisely their political system which has enabled the kind of growth outcomes that they have achieved. And so the question was that how does this come across in China's external actions? And so we find that alongside their increasing economic activity in the region through corridors or being the provider of public goods, there is simultaneously the idea that China's peculiar system is not so peculiar, it's not so unique, and there are lessons to be had for countries around China. These are countries that are, in explicit terms, everyone has their own paths of development, their national models of development, their social systems. However, the Chinese, there is implicitly an understanding that the Chinese have achieved a higher stage of growth, and they have achieved it because of their political system, and they're ready to offer this form of modernization to the smaller states in the region. And so this is not just in speech, this is also in action. In the report that Tino mentioned, we talk about these different workshops that the Chinese embassies are holding on governance. During COVID pandemic, the idea that how to regulate, how to control in terms of various investments in smart cities, again, this idea of how governance should be in order to achieve political stability, that in turn will lead to economic development. So this is one trend that we find increasing over a period of time. And the second trend in the politics aspect is that of conflict mediation. So here, as we referred to earlier, one of the major reasons that the Chinese are attributing to lower level of economic development in South Asia is this India-Pakistan conflict, or the regional conflicts, be it the civil war in Myanmar, or be it the conflicts between neighbors in South Asia. And so China is pitching itself as the mediator of these conflicts, again, which will ultimately lead to peace in the region and economic growth. So these two trends we find are increasing, not just in action, but also in speech. Yeah.
So this gives an important angle to look at, right? Because we have discussed economy, we have also discussed somewhat of a political or a political model or a political angle that in terms of governance that this gives to the topic, right? How about security? Do you think China also plays, because I personally feel that India plays a more dominating role when it comes to security and be it soft power or cultural power in the region as compared to China. Do you think that is an important challenge that China faces in terms of India? Yes, anyone. Shruti,
Um,
would you like
Actually,
to?
it's a good question, Abhishek, because I don't think we came across that term very much in the region. So it's always good to look also at the dogs that don't bark and the silence that speaks volumes in these speech analysis. Um, and now you're making us think, I think, which is good. I'm thinking through why not, maybe. So there's two parts. I mean, I would risk a diagnostic of why not. One is, in some ways, it is there, but it's not spelled out. So, what Shruti just mentioned, conflict mediation, right? It's a double conflict mediation. It's internal conflict and it's bilateral conflict. Internal would be issues as political instability, revolutions and coups like recently in Nepal or Bangladesh, etc. There's a domestic security angle about the stability in these countries that can lead to violence, civil war, like in Nepal in the past or Sri Lanka. So there is a presence there that when we speak about social systems and stability, the language, the phrases that do show up a lot in good governance, it is an insurance against political instability, which in itself can become conflict and exacerbate into actual civil war and insecurity, right? So that's one, I think, in which the security dimension is there in the Chinese speech when it comes to domestic political conflict. The other one is on interstate security, right? So when the Rohingya crisis happened 17, 18 onwards, the Chinese have, of course, announced a major mediation effort with special envoys, etc., which again was premised on the idea that if we want to grow in the Bay of Bengal region and develop economic development here, ergo Myanmar Economic Corridor, or BCIM, which these days is making a comeback again, as you may have seen, is again presupposed on a good bilateral relationship, and certainly not on 1 million people crossing borders, leading to refugee camps and creating, the potential for more violence or even insurgencies like in the Rakhine state. Similar, by the way, also the interstate level. The idea that China always suggests that it is open to play a constructive role between India and Pakistan is premised on the idea of a particular regional security architecture that they think of when they think of mediating between India and China. They will never say it as openly as President Trump, of course, but they have often said that they're ready if there's requests and there's interest from both sides, that they're ready to step in and facilitate that, including during Operation Sindoor, by the way, right? So I think there's a lot of security there, but it's not spelled out in open and in concrete terms. And maybe the reason is because, frankly, the way you positioned yourself, the way you have spoken, the tonality of these hundreds of speeches that we've analyzed is always one that is premised centrally and fundamentally on economic development and modernization. Growth, 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 trade, investments, upgrading the economy, right? Which, by the way, we can discuss that later to your Indian response, is very different from the way the Quad was born or reborn in 2017. So maybe my guess is if there's some logic to this speech, it's because the Chinese want to precisely cast this in the most economic, developmental, win-win approach possible. And any reference to security, regional security, would detract from that focus and that audience that they seek to engage and win over.
I'd like to just add something here. And when we are talking about security, they are talking about, as Dino also said, security and development are two sides of the same coin. And so when security is being talked about, I'd like to refer to this quote by Ambassador Sun Weidong, where he said that China and South Asia are political partners, economic partners, and a safety barrier to each other. And this is where the idea that China's peripheral security is essential to its own domestic security as well, where we are referring to the regions, Tibet, Xinjiang, etc. And so the idea that security is about conflict between states has to also include then ideas of terrorism, separatism, and extremism. Then this is what is most relevant to China when it comes to South Asia. And this is one of the most important angles through which it is looking at security in South Asia.
So, when we look at security, obviously, military cooperation is an extension to it, right? And because when I posed this question, the angle was also that when the so most of these countries, be it Nepal, be it Bangladesh, be it Pakistan, or even Sri Lanka for that matter, are in a need of growing security apparatus both for internal security and in some ways that extends to external security as well, right? So, what kind of partnership is there between these countries and China in terms of military cooperation? This I mean through direct military exchanges. This I also mean through defense partnerships, wherein there is the sale of equipment or the trade aspect of defense manufacturing as well.
Yeah, Abhishek, I mean, this is not part of this paper, but of the separate report we have done with people like Bhagya Sinaratne, who was at NYU Shanghai and is now at the Bandar Naik Center for International Studies in Colombo. We're having a conference soon with the paper by Hindu Karki, who's doing a PhD in China, looking at PLA, Nepal army relations, and a bunch of other papers, including Bangladesh, for example, too. So there, I think if I could share with you some of the findings, it's several levels of that defense diplomacy. There's one that you mentioned, which is about supplies of hardware. That's a story that is developing, has started in Bangladesh in particular, but goes back to the late 80s in Nepal when anti-aircraft guns were supposedly shared with Nepal and discovered and led to a major crisis between India and Nepal. But it's particularly a Bangladesh story since the 90s, but it's also becoming one in Sri Lanka, and in other countries around the region, Myanmar, Pakistan, for sure. We saw most recently how important those supplies are. The second level is one of what I would say the softer side of training, doctrines, defense exchanges, right, at the doctrinal level. And there we see an intensification of exchanges by military officials, defense civilian establishments, but particularly services who are engaging across the board, including with an increase in slots for defense training in China for the military officials and civilian officials from across the region. A third one is, again, operational in terms of deployments and joint exercises and preparedness. So, for example, I think 7 years ago, we had the first ever military exercise between the Nepal Army and the People's Liberation Army. That's amazing. I mean, since you had diplomatic relations since the late 50s, mid 50s, between China and Nepal, the two border states, after all, the neighboring states, that you only had the first ever military exercise between these two countries in 2017 or 18. But that's something that is happening across the board, also the military exercises and joint in some cases. The fourth and last, but maybe most important one, Abhishek, is one about new military warfare, new spaces. This is where many of these countries also have requirements. They want to be part of solutions and of responses on issues like cyber warfare, cybersecurity, of course, militarization of space. I think there's a lot of interest on those issues, and defense and technology production, right, and R&D in the defense space. Where there is, I think, growing engagement also. And that's, I think, a space that is worth watching, because I suspect we'll see much more of that in the next few years.
So, if we look at the partnerships from a different perspective, because we have repeatedly discussed in this podcast about how China also views this as China India plus one kind of situation where it wants India's partnership that way, right? And we have also seen how India doesn't trust China's role in that partnership, and that is why it's more reluctant towards adapting that. But my question is, what makes India accept other countries such as the US or be it Australia to actually be a part of partnership in the neighborhood region? Because in terms of India, it technically views both China and US as a similar level of threat when it comes to impacting its influence in the region. So I would really love to know your thoughts about that.
Tino, why don't you go first?
No, I'm keen to learn from you, Shruti. You're sitting in Australia, so tell us, why are the Australians more welcome in the region than the Chinese in Nepal or Sri Lanka, for example?
I think one of the most basic facts would be that we have a border dispute with China. And that is right now the most important critical aspect in India China relationship. And China's just, if I may refer to the ancient Indian wisdom, China's at our doorstep. And distance, of course, makes it easier for India to be interacting with other partner countries, say US or Australia or Japan. That would be one critical factor. So, when you say that India has similar levels of discomfort when it comes to the US and China being in the region, I'm not very certain of that in the current context. And then again, how much of an interest does, say, Japan or Australia have in the region? And how much of an interest does China have in the region? That also differs. For China, South Asia is critical to many things. It's critical to its connectivity, it's critical to its access to resources, and it's critical to its own domestic security. I don't see that being the case for either US, Japan, or Australia. So the kind of political investment they're going to make in the region is going to be different from what China is going to do in the region. Yeah, maybe that answers your question.
Yeah, I have another theory. Maybe, I mean, you're asking us for theories and why, I mean, broadly, the answer is you get along well bilaterally. I mean, the region reflects the state of bilateral relationships that India has with other regional powers, right? So let's look at Sri Lanka and Nepal, and I'll tell you what the state of India-Russia relations is, India-China relations, India-Australia relations, India-Japan relations, India-EU relations, India-France, India-US. So it's actually a good litmus test to tell you where India is doing well globally by looking within the region. And that's, I think, also what Shruti was saying, interestingly, like, yeah, I mean, the second one is a corporate or sort of marketing strategy. Generally, if you want to consolidate your consumer market, let's put it like that, you're not going to tie up with your immediate competitor, right? You're going to tie up with the competitor's competitor and further afield, because that competitor is farther away and has less interest and stakes in your immediate consumer market, right? A third one, I think, let me risk that a little bit. But when I speak to policymakers in the Indian system, Abhishek, there is a certain comfort in dealing with countries that think a little bit alike, not the same, about issues like order, what type of economic growth, what type of aid and assistance we should give these countries, what type of politics do you welcome in these countries. And I say alike because the US and India found themselves on very different pages on Bangladesh most recently. But bottom line, I see more of an overlap based maybe, and I'll say the big D word, democracy, and a worldview about types of governance. And democracy is not about elections necessarily, about human rights. It's about an inclusive pluralist system in Nepal and Sri Lanka where you have students take the streets and then you work with them and you hold elections. And I don't, and this is something I learned again from our research study, is that if you are a one party state that has done very well, and let us concede that to the People's Republic of China, has done extremely well in the history of great powers over the last 100 years, that rose through the ranks through a one party system, particular model. Therefore, what Shruti was saying, there is a relationship with economics, politics, and security that the Chinese think of, and that they recommend or prescribe or suggest to others. I mean, the same the Americans do, the same India does it too. We all powers in that sense like to prescribe, and we all humans like to look at things from the way things have worked for us. But it's not surprising if you look at it this way, that therefore an India and a Japan generally share the same view on how Sri Lanka should be ordered, its economy, its politics. And that's why maybe India, Japan, the Europeans are more comfortable with something called elections every 6 months, every 1 year, until you get it right. That's sometimes a policy. I mean, hold elections and see what comes out. I don't see anyone in China being comfortable, maybe even understanding this idea. In fact, Shruti, I think we saw this, and that's a suspicion I had for a long time from other engagements and understanding of China. But this paper brings it out in some ways even more, which is there's almost a puzzlement within China. And we have a piece just out with a diplomat 2 days ago, speaking about China's political troubles in South Asia, which means how do you deal with deeply embedded political pluralism, which could be good, normatively speaking, for economic distribution, but also, frankly, very harmful in terms of having 17 prime ministers in 20 years, the case of Nepal. I mean, if I was Chinese coming from one party state, I would be also scratching my head and saying, what's going on here? I mean, get your act together, centralize your power, uh, extend your policy planning view. And to do that, centralize your power politically within one person or one party or a condominium of a few people and get your act together. So, just to your question again, I think there's some philosophy, at least, that the democracies share in South Asia that makes India a little bit more comfortable to at least even have a discussion with these countries. Even if you disagree, then with the Chinese, then sometimes you actually may disagree, but the conversation is just not possible because you share fundamentally different philosophies on the role of politics towards economic development.
So in the end, we can say it's also the kind of partners that India allows. Also talks about the lesser of the two devils kind of thing, and democracy. The D word decides which one of them is a lesser of the devil, right?
Well, just yes, I mean, sometimes just a caveat. I mean, sometimes I want to say that China and India find themselves on the same page sometimes. That democracy is maybe not the right moment, is not we're not the right moment to hold elections, etc. Right? On Sheikh Hasina, for example, India and China were broadly on the same page in 2014-15, and there was the Americans and the Westerners who, at that point, of course, most recently again, but that point were pushing for to declare the elections null. So sometimes India will share that with China, order, but order is almost like the ideal for India is democracy and stability, right? And in fact, stability through democracy. That is the ideal scenario. That is not the ideal scenario for the People's Republic of China.
Right. So I think I'll end with this question. mainly is what can be the future trajectories in terms of how India and China would, can shape their relationship through the Indian neighborhood. What are your thoughts on that?
Shruti?
Okay, now that is the $1 million question.
Future's full of
Okay.
hope and optimism, so all yours.
Um, I think there has been scope of cooperation in the past, and the two countries have spoken about it. And I think one of the first idea is that India and China need to bilaterally cooperate, which can build trust for cooperation in other regions as well. So, in terms of bilateral cooperation, one of the biggest areas or the low hanging fruit, which is essential for development in both India and China, is climate and energy. So we at CSEP are doing a project where we are trying to figure out that if there is scope for such cooperation, because energy transition is one of the biggest goals that is closely intertwined with India's developmental prospects as well. So I think bilateral cooperation might be a way forward for cooperation within the region. And again, as we know that China has all of these ecological civilizational ideas. And can this be an area where India and China cooperate in the Himalayan ecosystem, or be it in the Indian Ocean or the Bay of Bengal? So I think, yeah, climate and energy and economy would be the major areas of cooperation in the future. Yes. Tino, would you like to add?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's good to think out of the box. I wrote a paper, I just revised it and republished it recently on the various C's in India, China, and South Asia. We talked a lot about conflict, which is where India and China go at each other in third countries. There's a zero-sum relationship there. They support different political factions, different actors. They make these stomping grounds for each other's influence in Nepal or Sri Lanka. That's the conflict relation. And there's one of competition, which is not going against each other, but trying to do better, which is healthy, in fact. India and China offer different things to these various neighbors in South Asia and the Indian Ocean region. And that competition can be positive for the recipient country, and even playing against each other, right? These countries are allowed to sort of have more India-China competition, something positive. There's also one of coordination. We've seen India and China sometimes actively discuss and divide labor a little bit. This has happened in the past in Sri Lanka, in Bangladesh, where India and China coordinate politically, economically their positions. And fourth, this would be the highest C, would be cooperation, right? And Shruti gave us one good example of where there could be possible regional spillover effects, positive ones, from an India-China climate and energy engagement. On economics, on trade, investments, development funds for the region, infrastructure and economic corridors, I would say there's another possible spillover effect of China-India cooperation. So I think we'll see a bit of all these four C's. We'll see moments where India and China will conflict in the region. We'll see moments where India and China have conversations and compete, where they coordinate, and sometimes where they will also actually have joint projects and coordinate. In some ways, they're doing it indirectly already through the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, the AIIB, of which they're the two largest shareholders, in which they have deployed already a lot of capital across the global south, but now also more and more in South Asia.
With that, I think we will come to an end of this podcast. Thank you so much, Constantino and Shruti, for taking the time to join us. And it was really a pleasure having you. We would really love to have you back on the show sometime soon.
Thank you. Great to have you. All the best for all things policy.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.